Good afternoon, Your Worship. In 2023, the City updated the Asset Management Investment Plan with the assistance of JW Infrastructure Planning. Based on this review, the total estimated replacement cost of the City's assets is $1.4 billion. The chart on the slide shows the breakdown between the individual utilities and the general fund, which is the largest portion of our assets at almost $600 million. With the continued escalating costs that we're experiencing, this asset replacement estimate is conservative and we expect it's significantly higher. Replacement of utility assets are funded by their respective user rates and the reserves and surpluses that are associated with those. And we have adopted a process that ensures the average annual life cycle investment amount, which we'll talk about in a moment, recommended in the utility rate review is being set aside, and then the capital expenditures for those utilities are drawn from those various reserves. This allows for a more wholesome approach to ensuring the operation of the utilities are sustainable. The general fund assets are of a larger concern, with projects being funded mainly by the annual dividend, community works grant, and equipment replacement contribution, and annual spending above this is funded by grants, debt borrowing, and reserves accordingly. The general fund is further broken down into a variety of categories, that's $600 million, and it's shown on the slide here. This represents the asset replacement value for one replacement in each of these categories. However, some of the assets would have multiple replacements compared to others. So, for example, a vehicle or a road would get replaced multiple times over the same life cycle of, say, a building for comparison purposes. Currently, the annual major maintenance and replacement of these assets, as well as new infrastructure, are all funded by the sources that I listed in the previous slide, and specific projects beyond the available funding are funded through debt financing. In 2019 to 2021, the City undertook the Asset and Amenity Management Program, which you heard briefly about in the last presentation, to further evaluate the City's facility assets and amenities and identify buildings that are reaching the end of their service life, and to recommend a long-term plan to manage those assets that is fiscally responsible while continuing to meet service levels. The four key recommendations were subsequently prioritized by Council as follows, with Fire Hall renewals, then the Twin Arenas, Arts and Cultural Centre, and the City Hall. As staff have been working through the first two priorities, estimates have been developed for each, with the Fire Hall renewals anticipated to be roughly $40 million and a Twin Pad Arena at anywhere between $70 to $80 million. Next slide. So capital projects are categorized in three ways: new, renewal, and growth. And we categorize them this way to more easily allow us to determine which projects should be funded, at least in part, through development cost charges, for example, for growth projects, and those that should be funded from reserves focused on asset sustainability, and that's namely the renewal category. Collectively, these projects are, again, largely funded through the dividend, the Canada Community Building Fund grant, and equipment replacement contributions, with an annual contribution of roughly $3.2 million. Where this annual amount is insufficient, as I noted, reserves are used, or in some cases, debt financing, and of course, grants are tried to be acquired where possible. So over the last 5 years, the City has spent roughly $12.6 million in all the categories on average. However, only $7 million of this has been in the renewal category, while the average annual life cycle investment recommended through our asset management plans is $13.6 million, so quite a large gap. So both the current average spending and the target well exceed the $3.2 million contribution that we are funding through the sources noted previously.
So focusing in specifically on the reserves that support the capital infrastructure, the three main sources are the Asset Sustainability Reserve, the Capital Reserve, and the Equipment Replacement Reserve. At the end of 2024, these reserves had a combined balance of $20 million, and based on the current council-approved budgets, are expected to decrease to $14.3 million by 2029. These figures don't contemplate any of the unfunded capital items that total approximately $160 million and are listed in detail in the financial plan, some of which are significant and upcoming over the next several years. Due to the escalation of vehicle costs over the past few years, the Equipment Replacement Reserve is actually forecasted to be fully depleted in 2027, as the current costs of replacement far outweigh the historical contributions that were made. In the last column is the optimum balance. This is significantly higher than the forecasted balances. The optimum balances were set as part of the update to the reserve policy in 2023, which reviewed other municipalities, best practices and were reviewed to more accurately reflect the investments that should be made to fund replacement of future assets. This information indicates that the city's general funding for infrastructure replacement is largely underfunded, which Ms. Dixon highlighted on the previous slide. In 2015, when the annual contribution to the Asset Sustainability Reserve was determined and endorsed by Council, the increase was based on the 10-year expected replacement values as per the city's master plans for certain general fund assets such as facilities. At that time, the investment was considered sufficient, as this was prior to any of the asset management investment plan work that was subsequently done in 2017 and 2018, which identified the significant infrastructure deficit that the city has. The amount was at that time set at a flat dollar, a dollar amount of $300,000, which at that time equated to approximately 1% of taxation. However, in 2025, that same amount now equates to only 0.6% of property tax. As a result, staff are recommending that the strategy be modified to instead be set each year based on a percentage of taxation. This will allow that annual contribution to increase naturally in line with the annual tax increase and the growth of the community, such as non-market change. These annual increases will continue to compound year over year with the goal of achieving an annual contribution that aligns with the city's asset renewal needs. In terms of how that equates to a dollar value, it is challenging for us to provide exact figures because tax revenues are dependent on annual deliberations and the tax increases that council decides during that process. However, if we take the estimated tax revenues from the 2025 to 2029 financial plan and multiply that by the 4.25%, a base estimate can be calculated, which would see that amount increase on average by approximately $120,000 per year. Asset Management BC has a long-term financial plan for asset management guide, which provides us with guidance on how to value asset replacement. And on that basis, the sustainable annual funding required for the city's general fund would be $4.5 million, or approximately 9% of property tax. It's important to note that this calculation is only for replacement of current assets. Any brand new infrastructure would need to be funded in addition to that amount. Currently, the city is contributing approximately a net of $1.9 million annually, a shortfall of $2.6 million, or 5.2% of property taxes. By increasing the city's annual contribution by 1% of taxation per year, this shortfall could be addressed over roughly the next 5 years. Funds collected would continue to be transferred directly to the Asset Sustainability Reserve. As Council approves all capital budget items and reserve transfers, either through the financial plan or updates brought to regular Council meetings, they would continue to have full discretion on the use of the reserve. At the last Council meeting on June 24th, staff provided the results of the Sports and Recreation Needs Assessment, or SRNA. This report included the top-ranked areas for investment into community amenities, including trails and pathways, ice arenas, dry floor facilities, large-span multi-sport facilities, indoor field facilities, and grass sports fields. Also at that Council meeting, the results of the 2025 Community Survey were presented to Council, and similar to the results for the SRNA, the public prioritized the investment into parks and sports fields, along with several other capital-related items. This is all in addition to the assets noted by Ms. Dixon earlier, such as fire halls and an arts and culture center, that doesn't include other major city assets requiring investment, such as transportation projects. By increasing the infrastructure levy by an additional 1% each year, the contribution to the Asset Sustainability Reserve would reach 9% of property taxes in alignment with the best practices. While this is the recommended strategy, Council would have the opportunity to consider that levy in consideration of the broader financial impacts and other competing needs through each annual budget process. It is recognized that an increase of 5.2% at one time, in addition to other regular annual increases, would be a significant burden on taxpayers. To mitigate that impact, staff is recommending phasing the increase over the next 5 years until that levy is equal to 9% of taxation. Staff would include the 1% in the base budget, but Council would have the opportunity to consider all financial impacts and approve the final percentage during deliberations. Should Council decide to reduce the percentage contribution in any given year, this would just extend the phasing past 2030. Staff believe adopting this strategy now is optimal, with continued increasing inflationary costs for construction and significant capital projects on the horizon, such as the fire hall and the arenas. Delaying further investment into reserves for the capital program will defer and compound the shortfall of funding into future years, creating a significantly larger impact to taxpayers as capital needs continue to grow and required funding is unavailable. A debt-funded asset replacement would require new funding to pay the debt servicing costs, which could be significant. For example, a 20-year, $40 million loan would require over $3 million in annual payments. From a review of other surrounding communities, those that don't have a dedicated source for asset renewals have required 10 to 15% tax increases to fund specific asset renewals, and often have to phase those in over 2 to 3 years to try to ease the burden on taxpayers. Looking at this from the perspective of a homeowner, it would be similar to knowing that something in your home was going to fail and required replacement in several years' time. That money can either be saved and set aside annually until enough exists to pay for the project, or when it fails, the full amount will need to be found all at once. Going back to the 2022 tax deferral, which was finally incorporated during the last budget cycle, this was a similar buy now and fund later approach. Council made a commitment during deliberations to bring on resources that needed to be paid for immediately and decided that those would be incorporated into future tax years. The infrastructure levy is designed as a sustainable funding model, placing those funds into the dedicated reserve to be used specifically for asset renewals, which would smooth costs for the taxpayers. This approach seeks to avoid significant tax increases each time a renewal is needed, which would have to be phased in over a shorter time frame with more significant increases and impacts. From a review of other surrounding communities, ones that have successfully implemented a similar levy include West Kelowna, Vernon, and Kelowna. Regardless of further investments, staff do recommend that the current contribution be converted to a percentage of taxation rather than a fixed dollar amount. This would at least ensure that the current contribution is not continually eroded. However, it would result in that annual contribution remaining flat rather than growing towards the target of 9%. With that, the staff recommendation is that council direct staff to move the current infrastructure levy from a set amount of $2.1 million annually to be an annual contribution of 4.25% of property taxes, and that council direct staff to phase in an annual increase to move the infrastructure levy to a total of 9% of property taxes planned over the years 2026 to 2030, with final determination of each increase as part of the budget process, and that council direct staff to update the financial management policy. Ms. Dixon and I are happy to take any questions council may have.